Picture this. You're standing in line at the airport, tired from travel, when you notice an elderly man ahead of you wearing what looks like old military decorations. Maybe you roll your eyes, thinking he's just another person trying to get attention with fake medals. Maybe you even make a joke to your friend about weekend warriors and their costume jewelry. 9 minutes later, that same airport erupts into chaos, and suddenly, that fake hero becomes the only thing standing between hundreds of innocent people and disaster. Sometimes the most ordinary moments hide the most extraordinary people. Sometimes our worst assumptions about others reveal our own blindness to true greatness. And sometimes, in the span of less than 10 minutes, everything we think we know about courage, honor, and what makes a real hero gets turned completely upside down. This is the story of Marcus Chun, a 28-year-old marketing executive who thought he had life figured out, who believed he could judge a person's worth by their appearance, who was about to learn that the most dangerous assumption you can make is that you know who the heroes are just by looking at them. What happened next would not only save hundreds of lives, but would forever change how one man understood the true meaning of service, sacrifice, and the quiet dignity of those who have given everything for their country. Marcus Chun pulled his phone from his pocket for the 5th time in 3 minutes, checking his boarding time again even though he knew it by heart. Flight 447 to Denver, departure 3:15 p.m. He had 40 minutes to kill, and the security line at Chicago O'Hare was moving slower than molasses in winter. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with that particular airport frequency that seemed designed to make everyone irritable, and Marcus was already there. His Armani suit, usually a source of quiet confidence, felt wrinkled and uncomfortable after the morning's back-to-back client meetings. The Hartley Corporation deal had finally closed, earning him a hefty commission and a week-long vacation in Colorado that he desperately needed. At 28, Marcus had climbed the corporate ladder faster than most, earning 6 figures at a marketing firm that represented some of the biggest brands in America. He prided himself on reading people quickly, sizing up their value in a glance. It was a skill that served him well in business, where first impressions often determined million-dollar deals. That's when he noticed the old man. 3 people ahead of him in line stood a figure that immediately caught Marcus's attention for all the wrong reasons. The man appeared to be in his 70s, with silver hair that needed a trim and clothes that had seen better days. His faded blue jeans were clean but worn thin at the knees, and his button-down shirt, while pressed, was the kind you might find at a discount store. What really drew Marcus's eye, though, were the medals pinned to the man's chest. Military decorations, from the look of them, arranged in neat rows across his shirt pocket. Even from several feet away, Marcus could see ribbons and stars, bronze and silver metalwork catching the harsh terminal lighting. The old man stood quietly, hands clasped behind his back in a posture that spoke of decades of discipline, his weathered face calm and patient as the line inched forward. Marcus felt his lips curl into a smirk. He had seen this type before, usually at veterans events or patriotic celebrations. Wannabes who bought their service record online, playing dress-up with unearned honors. The whole thing struck him as pathetic. If the guy was really some kind of war hero, what was he doing flying coach through Chicago wearing clothes that probably came from a thrift store? He pulled out his phone and started typing a message to his college roommate, Jake, who was probably still at their marketing firm grinding through afternoon meetings. "You won't believe what I'm seeing at O'Hare right now," Marcus typed, his thumbs moving quickly across the screen. Some old guy playing soldier boy with what looks like every medal the military ever made pinned to his shirt. Seriously pathetic. Probably bought the whole costume on eBay. He paused, glancing up at the man again. The stranger hadn't moved from his position, hadn't checked his phone or fidgeted like everyone else in line. He just stood there with that same quiet dignity, occasionally nodding politely when other passengers squeezed past him in the crowded security area. Marcus continued typing. "I mean, if you're going to fake being a war hero, at least dress the part, right? This guy looks like he shops at Goodwill. Probably never served a day in his life. Just another attention seeker trying to get respect he never earned." He hit send and slipped the phone back into his pocket, feeling satisfied with his assessment. It was the kind of quick character judgment that had served him well in business. In Marcus's world, success was measured in visible markers: expensive suits, luxury watches, the right car, the right address. People who had really accomplished something showed it. They didn't shuffle through airports in discount clothing, no matter what medals they wore. The line moved forward another few steps, bringing Marcus closer to the security checkpoint. Around him, the usual airport chaos continued unabated. Business travelers juggled phones and laptops while checking their watches. Families wrestled with children and carry-on luggage. Flight announcements echoed through the terminal in that particular monotone that somehow managed to be both urgent and boring at the same time. Now boarding Group A passengers for Flight 892 to Los Angeles. Came the announcement from a nearby gate, followed by the familiar sounds of passengers shuffling toward the jetway. Marcus glanced at his watch, a Rolex Submariner that had cost him 3 months' salary, but was worth every penny for the message it sent. Time management was everything in his business, and he prided himself on never being late, never being unprepared. Every detail mattered, from his Italian leather shoes to his precisely knotted tie. Image was everything. That's why the old man ahead of him was so irritating. The guy was obviously trying to project an image of military service and heroism, but he was doing it all wrong. Real success, real accomplishment, came with real rewards. If someone had truly served their country with distinction, they wouldn't be standing in line at a commercial airport looking like they couldn't afford a decent meal, let alone proper clothes to honor their supposed service. Marcus's phone buzzed with Jake's response. Haha, stolen valor much? Should report him to airport security. Isn't that illegal or something? Marcus typed back quickly. Right? It's insulting to real veterans. This guy's probably never been closer to combat than a Call of Duty game. He was about to hit send when something made him pause. The old man had turned slightly, and Marcus caught a glimpse of his profile. There was something in the man's expression that didn't quite match Marcus's assessment. The stranger's eyes held a quality that Marcus couldn't immediately identify. Not the desperate need for attention that he'd expected, but something deeper. Sadder, maybe, or wiser. The kind of look that came from seeing things that most people would never see, experiencing things that left permanent marks on a person's soul. For just a moment, Marcus felt a flicker of uncertainty, but he pushed it aside. He'd learned to trust his instincts about people, and his instincts told him this was just another case of stolen valor. The man's shabby appearance was all the proof he needed. Marcus finished his text and sent it, then put his phone away and focused on moving through the security line. In a few minutes, he'd be past this irritating encounter, settled into his business class seat with a drink in hand, leaving Chicago and this pathetic display behind him. He had better things to think about than some old man's desperate attempt at relevance. The security checkpoint was now just a few people away. TSA agents moved with practiced efficiency, checking IDs, directing passengers through metal detectors and body scanners. The familiar rhythm of airport security played out around them. Shoes off, electronics in bins, liquids in clear bags. It was a routine that Marcus had performed hundreds of times, part of the comfortable predictability of his successful, well-ordered life. He pulled out his ID and boarding pass, double-checking that everything was in order even though he'd organized his travel documents with his usual precision. The old man ahead of him was doing the same thing, reaching into his wallet with movements that spoke of military precision despite his age. That's when Marcus noticed the man's hands. They were scarred. Not the kind of small scars that came from ordinary life, but deep, purposeful marks that spoke of serious injury. Burns, from the look of them, covering the backs of both hands and disappearing under his shirt sleeves. The kind of scars that told a story Marcus suddenly wasn't sure he wanted to know. But he pushed the thought aside. Scars could come from anywhere. A car accident, a workplace injury, a dozen different mundane explanations. It didn't change his assessment of the situation. The man was still wearing unearned honors, still playing a part he had no right to play. Marcus checked his watch again. 2:47 p.m. Plenty of time to get through security and grab a coffee before boarding. His vacation in Colorado was going to be exactly what he needed to recharge before the next quarter's challenges. A week of skiing, good food, and no client meetings. No having to read people and negotiate deals and constantly prove himself worthy of his success. The old man reached the front of the security line and handed over his documents to the TSA agent. Marcus couldn't hear their exchange, but he saw the agent's expression change slightly as he examined the man's identification. A flicker of recognition, maybe, or respect. The kind of look that suggested the old man was more than he appeared to be. But Marcus dismissed it. Airport security agents were trained to be polite to everyone, especially elderly passengers who might need extra assistance. It didn't mean anything. The man collected his documents and moved toward the metal detector, his movements still carrying that military precision that Marcus had noticed earlier. There was something about the way he held himself, the way he moved, that suggested a lifetime of discipline and training. But even that could be learned, Marcus reasoned. Plenty of people adopted military bearing without ever serving. It was part of the act. Marcus stepped forward to the document check station, handing over his own ID and boarding pass with the confidence that came from knowing everything was in perfect order. The TSA agent glanced at his documents, looked at Marcus's face, and waved him through without comment. Business as usual. As he walked toward the metal detector, Marcus caught sight of the old man again, now collecting his belongings from the security screening. The medals on his shirt caught the light, and, for just a moment, Marcus wondered what they actually were. Bronze stars, purple hearts, service ribbons from campaigns he'd only read about in history books. If they were real, they represented a level of service and sacrifice that Marcus had never considered seriously. But they couldn't be real. Real heroes didn't look like this man looked, didn't dress like he dressed, didn't fly commercial through Chicago O'Hare looking like they were counting every penny. Real heroes had been rewarded for their service, had parlayed their military experience into successful careers, had something to show for their sacrifices. Marcus placed his belongings in the plastic bins and walked through the metal detector, the familiar beep confirming what he already knew. Everything was in order, everything was as it should be. His life was organized, successful, predictable. He understood how the world worked, understood the relationship between merit and reward, between service and recognition. In less than 9 minutes, everything he thought he knew about heroes, about service, about the true measure of a man's worth, would be tested in ways he never could have imagined. But, for now, Marcus Chun collected his belongings from the security screening, checked his watch once more, and walked deeper into the terminal, leaving the old man behind and focusing on his upcoming vacation. He had no idea that the man he'd just dismissed as a fraud was about to become the only thing standing between hundreds of innocent people and disaster. He had no idea that his comfortable assumptions about the world were about to be shattered by 9 minutes of chaos that would change everything he thought he knew about courage, honor, and what makes a real hero. The terminal hummed around him with its usual energy, flights departing and arriving, people hurrying to their gates or settling in for long delays. Just another ordinary day at one of America's busiest airports. Marcus pulled out his phone to check his messages one more time, smiling slightly at his earlier texts about the old man and his stolen valor. In 8.5 minutes, he wouldn't be smiling anymore. Marcus found his gate and settled into one of the uncomfortable chairs that seemed specifically designed to discourage lingering. Gate B12 was typical for O'Hare, overcrowded, understaffed, and filled with the particular mixture of stress and boredom that defined modern air travel. He pulled out his laptop and tried to focus on some last-minute client emails, but his attention kept drifting to the flow of passengers around him. The old man from the security line had apparently disappeared into the maze of the terminal. Marcus felt a slight relief at not having to see that pathetic display of stolen valor anymore. He'd dealt with enough fake people in his business career to recognize the type from a mile away. The marketing world was full of people who inflated their credentials, exaggerated their achievements, or outright lied about their backgrounds to get ahead. This wasn't any different. His phone buzzed with another message from Jake. Speaking of veterans, my cousin Danny just got back from his second deployment in Afghanistan. Says the real deal never talks about their service, especially not to strangers. Your airport guy sounds like a total fraud. Marcus typed back, exactly. Real heroes don't need to advertise. They let their success speak for itself. He leaned back in his chair, satisfied with his analysis. In Marcus's world, authenticity was measured by results. People who had really accomplished something had something to show for it. Military heroes became successful businessmen, respected community leaders, wealthy consultants who leveraged their service into profitable careers. They didn't shuffle through airports in discount clothes wearing medals that probably came from a costume shop. Around him, the usual pre-boarding chaos was beginning to build. Flight 447 to Denver was scheduled to depart in 25 minutes. Passengers were starting to gather near the gate counter. Marcus recognized the familiar types: business travelers like himself checking phones and laptops, families struggling with children and oversized carry-on bags, elderly couples moving slowly and carefully through the crowded space. Near the window that looked out onto the tarmac, a young mother was trying to calm a crying baby while simultaneously managing a toddler who seemed determined to explore every inch of the gate area. Her husband, a man in his 30s wearing a military uniform, was helping with luggage while occasionally reaching over to steady their older child. Marcus noticed the man's insignia indicated he was probably returning from deployment, heading home with his family. Now that was what a real serviceman looked like. Young, fit, wearing his uniform with obvious pride. The kind of person who had earned the right to respect through current, active service. Not some old man playing dress-up with medals that were probably bought online. Marcus's attention was drawn to a commotion near the coffee stand about 50 yards from his gate. A group of teenagers was being loud and obnoxious, apparently thinking that their volume and profanity made them seem cool or mature. Their conversation was peppered with complaints about flight delays, expensive airport food, and general dissatisfaction with everything around them. The kind of entitled behavior that Marcus found particularly irritating. He was about to put in his earbuds to block out their noise when he noticed someone else watching the teenagers with obvious concern. It was the old man from the security line. He had apparently been sitting quietly in a corner near the coffee stand. But the teenager's behavior had clearly caught his attention. Marcus could see him evaluating the situation. That same disciplined alertness he'd noticed earlier now focused on the disruptive group. For a moment, Marcus wondered if the old man would approach the teenagers, maybe try to play the role of the stern veteran correcting disrespectful youth. It would be exactly the kind of attention-seeking behavior Marcus expected from someone wearing stolen valor. The perfect opportunity to play the part of the wise old soldier, sharing life lessons with the younger generation. But the man didn't move. He simply watched, his expression thoughtful and concerned but not judgmental. There was something about his stillness that suggested he was assessing the situation from multiple angles, considering factors that weren't obvious to casual observers. It was the kind of watchful awareness that Marcus had seen in security professionals and law enforcement officers, people whose job required them to constantly evaluate potential threats. Marcus dismissed the observation. Anyone could learn to look alert and aware. It was probably part of the old man's act, trying to seem like a vigilant protector watching over innocent civilians. The whole thing was becoming more pathetic by the minute. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed his client, Richard Hartley, the CEO whose company had just signed the deal that made Marcus's Colorado vacation possible. "Marcus, good to catch you before your flight," came Hartley's distinctive voice. "I wanted to thank you again for the work you did on this campaign. The board was impressed with your presentation, especially your insights about target demographics and consumer psychology." "Thank you, Mr. Hartley. I appreciate the feedback," Marcus replied, standing up and walking a few steps away from the crowd for better phone reception. "I'm looking forward to seeing the campaign launch when I get back from vacation." "You've earned it," Hartley said. "But I have to ask, how do you do it? How do you read people so quickly and accurately? Your assessment of our target market was spot on. But you seem to understand our customers better than they understand themselves." Marcus felt a familiar surge of pride. This was exactly the kind of recognition that validated his approach to life and business. "I've learned to look past the surface," he said. "Most people present themselves one way, but are actually something completely different. You have to learn to see through the performance to understand who they really are and what they really want." "That's a valuable skill," Hartley agreed. "Too many people take others at face value without digging deeper. You clearly understand that authenticity is rare, and success comes from seeing things as they really are, not as people pretend they are." After ending the call, Marcus felt even more confident in his assessment of the old man with the medals. His entire career was built on his ability to see through facades and identify the truth about people. He'd made millions for his clients by understanding the difference between what people claimed to be and who they actually were. The old man was just another case study in human deception, another example of someone trying to claim respect and attention they hadn't earned. He returned to his seat and checked his watch again. 18 minutes until boarding. The gate area was getting more crowded as other flights prepared for departure, and the ambient noise level was rising. Conversations in multiple languages mixed with flight announcements, crying children, and the constant electronic beeping of various devices. Near the window, the military family was still struggling with their children and luggage. Marcus noticed that other passengers were giving them respectful space, recognizing the uniform and the obvious signs that this was a family reunion after deployment. That was appropriate respect, Marcus thought. Recognition given to people who were clearly serving their country in an active, current capacity. The contrast with the old man's pathetic display was obvious. Real service was happening right now by young men and women who were currently putting their lives on the line for their country, not by elderly frauds trying to claim credit for imaginary heroics from imaginary conflicts. Marcus opened his laptop again and tried to focus on organizing his vacation itinerary. He'd booked a suite at a luxury ski resort in Aspen, complete with private ski lessons and access to exclusive restaurants. After months of high-pressure client meetings and competitive negotiations, he was looking forward to a week of first-class everything. Success had its privileges, and Marcus had earned the right to enjoy them. He was scrolling through restaurant reviews when a new announcement came over the terminal's public address system. Ladies and gentlemen, we have reports of severe weather moving into the Denver area. Several flights to Colorado destinations may experience delays. Passengers should check with their gate agents for updated departure information. Marcus felt a spike of irritation. Weather delays were one of the few things money couldn't solve, one of the few situations where his success and preparation couldn't guarantee the outcome he wanted. He walked over to the gate counter, where a small crowd of passengers was already gathering to ask questions about their flights. The gate agent, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, was doing her best to handle multiple anxious travelers simultaneously. Flight 447 to Denver is still scheduled for on-time departure, she announced to the growing crowd. We're monitoring the weather situation, but, as of right now, we expect to board normally. Marcus returned to his seat feeling slightly better. His vacation plans were still intact, his careful scheduling still on track. In less than an hour, he'd be airborne, leaving Chicago and its collection of frauds and disappointments behind him. But, as he settled back into his chair, something caught his eye that made him pause. The old man with the medals was no longer sitting by the coffee stand. Instead, he was walking slowly through the gate area, his movements purposeful but unhurried. As Marcus watched, the man approached the military family by the window. Marcus couldn't hear their conversation from his position, but he could see the interaction clearly. The old man spoke briefly to the young soldier, who listened with obvious respect before responding with what appeared to be gratitude. Then, the old man knelt down to the toddler's level, saying something that made the child smile and reach out to touch one of the medals on his shirt. The young soldier's wife joined the conversation, and Marcus could see her thanking the old man with genuine warmth. Whatever he had said to their family had clearly made a positive impression. The crying baby had quieted, and the restless toddler was now sitting calmly next to the old man, apparently fascinated by something he was showing them. Marcus felt a moment of confusion. The interaction didn't match his assessment of the situation. If the old man was a fraud wearing stolen valor, why wasn't the active duty soldier calling him out? Military personnel were typically the first to spot and confront people wearing unearned honors. Instead, this soldier seemed to be treating the old man with genuine respect and deference. But Marcus pushed the doubt aside. Maybe the soldier was just being polite to an elderly passenger. Maybe he hadn't gotten a close look at the medals and didn't realize they were fake. Or maybe he was just focused on his family and not paying attention to the details. The old man stood up slowly, said something final to the family, and continued his walk through the gate area. Marcus noticed that he moved with a slight limp, favoring his left leg in a way that suggested old injury rather than simple age. The scars on his hands, the careful way he moved, the respectful response from an active duty soldier. For just a moment, all of these details combined to create a picture that didn't match Marcus's original assessment. But only for a moment. Marcus had built his career on trusting his instincts about people, and his instincts said this was all part of an elaborate performance. People who really had something to be proud of didn't need to walk around advertising it to strangers. They certainly didn't dress like they couldn't afford decent clothes or fly commercial through busy airports looking like they were barely making ends meet. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. Hope your flight is on time. The weather reports from Denver don't look great, but fingers crossed for your vacation. Marcus typed back. Thanks. Should be fine. Looking forward to a week away from fake people and their pathetic attempts at attention. As he hit send, he noticed that the old man had completed his circuit of the gate area and was now sitting quietly near the boarding counter, hands folded in his lap, eyes alert but calm. The same watchful awareness Marcus had noticed earlier, the same sense that this was someone who was constantly evaluating his surroundings for potential issues. The gate agent made another announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we have updated information on Flight 447 to Denver. We are still planning to depart on time, but passengers should be prepared for the possibility of weather-related delays once we're in the air. We'll keep you informed of any changes. Around the gate area, passengers shifted restlessly. Some checked their phones for weather updates. Others gathered closer to the counter hoping for more detailed information. The general mood was becoming more anxious as people worried about missed connections, canceled vacation plans, and the uncertainties of traveling in bad weather. Marcus checked his own weather app and saw that Denver was indeed experiencing significant storm activity. But his resort was in Aspen, nearly 200 miles away, and the weather there looked clear. Even if there were delays getting to Denver, he should still be able to reach his final destination without too much inconvenience. He was scrolling through more weather reports when he noticed something that made him look up from his phone. The old man was standing again, but this time his posture was different. More alert, more focused. He was looking towards something beyond Marcus's field of vision, his expression serious and concentrated. Marcus turned to see what had caught the man's attention, but all he could see was the normal flow of airport activity. Passengers walking to and from gates, airport employees going about their duties, the usual controlled chaos of a busy terminal. But the old man continued to watch something with the intensity of someone who had seen something important, something that other people had missed. His hands were no longer folded calmly in his lap, but were ready at his sides, and his weight was shifted forward slightly, as if he was prepared to move quickly if necessary. Marcus felt a flicker of unease without understanding why. The old man's behavior was beginning to seem less like attention-seeking performance, and more like genuine alertness to some kind of threat. But what threat could there possibly be in a busy airport terminal on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon? He was about to dismiss his concern as overactive imagination when the first explosion echoed through the terminal, and everything changed forever. The sound was unlike anything Marcus had ever heard in person. Not the controlled explosion of movie special effects or the distant rumble of construction work, but the sharp, violent crack of something fundamental breaking apart. The lights in their section of the terminal flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging the gate area into the gray twilight of emergency lighting. For a heartbeat, everything was silent. Then, the screaming started. Marcus's first instinct was to freeze. His mind struggled to process what was happening, to categorize this sudden shift from ordinary afternoon travel into something that belonged in nightmares or news reports about other people in other places. Around him, hundreds of passengers were having the same reaction, a moment of stunned disbelief followed by panic as the reality of the situation began to sink in. But while Marcus and everyone else stood paralyzed by shock, the old man was already moving. He didn't run toward the exits like the crowd that was beginning to surge past him. He didn't pull out his phone to call for help or stand frozen in place trying to understand what was happening. Instead, he moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of chaos, someone whose body remembered what to do even when his mind might be overwhelmed by the magnitude of the crisis. Marcus watched in fascination as the man he had dismissed as a fraud transformed before his eyes. The shuffling gait was gone, replaced by purposeful movement that spoke of decades of training and experience. The quiet demeanor was replaced by focused command presence that seemed to create a pocket of calm in the growing storm of panic around him. The old man's first action was to reach the young military family by the window. Marcus could see him speaking quickly but calmly to the soldier, his words apparently cutting through the man's shock and confusion. Within seconds, the young father was nodding and moving to gather his family, his military training kicking in as he responded to what was clearly a voice of authority and experience. A second explosion, closer this time, sent vibrations through the floor and ceiling. Emergency announcements began blaring from speakers throughout the terminal, but the words were barely comprehensible over the growing noise of hundreds of people trying to evacuate simultaneously. All passengers must immediately evacuate the terminal, proceed to the nearest emergency exit, remain calm, and move in an orderly fashion. But there was nothing orderly about what was happening. The crowd was becoming a mob, people pushing and shoving as they tried to reach the exits they could see in the distance. Children were crying, adults were shouting questions that no one could answer, and the careful civility of airport culture was dissolving into something much more primitive and dangerous. Marcus found himself caught in the flow of people moving toward what they hoped was safety. He was pressed forward by bodies behind him, unable to see clearly over the heads of the crowd, struggling to maintain his footing as the mob surged toward the distant exits. His expensive suit was getting wrinkled and torn as other passengers pushed past him, and his carefully organized travel documents were scattered somewhere on the floor behind him. But even in the middle of his own fear and confusion, Marcus couldn't stop watching the old man. Instead of joining the exodus toward the main exits, He was moving against the crowd, heading deeper into the terminal. Marcus caught glimpses of him through the chaos, helping an elderly woman who had fallen, lifting a small child who was in danger of being trampled, creating small islands of order in the sea of panic that surrounded them. Most remarkably, people were listening to him. In a situation where everyone was terrified and thinking only of their own escape, passengers were actually stopping to follow the old man's directions. Marcus saw him organize a group of travelers to help carry luggage for a family with small children. He watched him direct a group of teenagers to escort elderly passengers toward what appeared to be a secondary exit that most people weren't using. There was something about his voice, his presence, his absolute confidence in the middle of chaos that cut through the panic and spoke to something deeper in the people around him. He wasn't just helping individuals. He was creating structure and purpose out of confusion and fear. A third explosion, this one accompanied by the sound of breaking glass and falling debris, sent a new wave of terror through the crowd. The emergency lighting flickered again, and for several seconds they were plunged into complete darkness. Marcus could hear people crying, shouting, praying in multiple languages as they struggled to find their way in the blackness. When the lights came back on, Marcus saw something that made his blood run cold. Smoke was beginning to fill the terminal from somewhere ahead of them, and the crowd was being forced to compress into a smaller and smaller space as exits became blocked or inaccessible. What had started as panic was becoming a genuine, life-threatening crush of people with nowhere to go. That's when Marcus heard the old man's voice for the first time, cutting through the noise with the authority of someone accustomed to command in crisis situations. "Listen to me," he shouted, and somehow his voice carried over the chaos. "I need everyone to stop pushing and listen. There's another way out, but we have to work together." Marcus watched in amazement as people actually responded. The mob didn't immediately transform into an orderly group, but the most dangerous, surging motion stopped as passengers turned toward the voice that seemed to know what it was doing. The old man had positioned himself on a chair near the gate counter, making himself visible to as many people as possible. "My name is Colonel James Rodriguez, United States Army," he announced, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of decades of military leadership. "I've been in situations like this before, and I'm going to get all of us out safely. But I need everyone to follow my instructions exactly." Marcus felt his world tilt on its axis. Colonel James Rodriguez, United States Army. The medals on his shirt weren't costume jewelry bought online. They were real decorations earned in real conflicts by a real soldier who was now taking command of a situation that was quickly becoming a disaster. Everything Marcus had assumed about this man, every judgment he had made, every dismissive comment he had sent to his friend Jake, was not just wrong but, humiliatingly, dangerously wrong. The person he had mocked as a fraud was now the only thing standing between hundreds of innocent people and what was beginning to look like a genuine catastrophe. But there was no time for Marcus to fully process his error. Rodriguez was already organizing the crowd with the efficiency of someone who had managed much larger groups under much more dangerous circumstances. "I need all military personnel, active or retired, to identify yourselves and help me organize groups," he called out. Several people raised their hands, including the young soldier with his family. "Law enforcement, fire department, medical personnel, anyone with emergency training, please come forward." Within minutes, Rodriguez had created a command structure out of chaos. He assigned each of his impromptu lieutenants a group of civilians to escort and protect. He identified parents with small children and made sure they were given priority access to whatever safe routes became available. He spotted elderly passengers who would need assistance and made sure they were paired with younger, stronger travelers who could help them move quickly when necessary. All of this was happening while smoke continued to fill the terminal, while emergency alarms blared incessantly, while the sounds of destruction and chaos echoed from other parts of the building. But in their section of the terminal, order was beginning to emerge from panic because one man had the experience, the training, and the courage to take responsibility for everyone around him. Marcus found himself assigned to a group led by a retired police officer who was following Rodriguez's directions. As they began to move toward what Rodriguez had identified as a safer exit route, Marcus caught one more glimpse of the colonel. He was carrying an elderly man who couldn't walk quickly enough to keep up with the evacuation, while simultaneously coordinating with other group leaders via hand signals and shouted instructions. His clothes were now torn and dirty from helping other people, and Marcus could see that he was limping more heavily as he pushed his clearly aging body beyond its normal limits. But there was nothing in his expression that suggested doubt or hesitation. This was what he had trained for his entire adult life: protecting others, taking responsibility for their safety, putting their needs ahead of his own comfort or survival. The medals on his shirt weren't decorations. They were evidence of decades spent learning how to be exactly the person everyone around him needed him to be in moments like this. As Marcus's group moved through the terminal following the route Rodriguez had mapped out, Marcus could hear him continuing to organize and encourage the remaining passengers. His voice never wavered, never showed panic or uncertainty, even as the situation around them grew more dangerous and chaotic. "Stay together, watch out for each other," came his voice from behind them. "We're going to get everyone out safely. No one gets left behind. No one gets left behind." Marcus had heard that phrase before, usually in movies about military operations or in speeches about the values that guided American soldiers. But he had never understood what it really meant until this moment, when he was watching a 70-something-year-old man put that principle into action in real time, under real pressure, with real lives hanging in the balance. The smoke was getting thicker as they moved through the terminal, and Marcus could see flames in the distance through the windows that looked out onto the tarmac. Whatever was happening wasn't just a single isolated incident, but something larger and more dangerous. The kind of crisis that could overwhelm airport security, emergency services, and anyone else who wasn't prepared to handle it. Anyone except Colonel James Rodriguez, who was prepared because he had spent his entire adult life preparing for situations exactly like this one, who had earned those medals not through political connections or public relations campaigns, but by proving over and over again that he could be trusted with other people's lives when everything went wrong. As Marcus followed his group towards safety, he thought about the text messages he had sent earlier, the dismissive comments he had made about stolen valor and fake heroes. He thought about his conversation with Richard Hartley about the importance of seeing through facades to understand who people really were. He had been right about the importance of seeing past appearances to understand the truth about people. He had just been completely wrong about which direction he was looking. The man he had dismissed as a fraud based on his shabby appearance and humble circumstances was proving to be exactly what his medals claimed he was: a genuine hero who had earned the right to wear them through decades of service and sacrifice. And Marcus, who prided himself on his ability to read people accurately, had failed the test completely. His sophisticated understanding of human nature, his successful track record of seeing through deception and identifying authenticity, had led him to exactly the wrong conclusion about the most important person in the room. As they reached the exit Rodriguez had directed them toward, Marcus turned back for one last look at the man who was saving all of their lives. Through the smoke and chaos, he could see the colonel still moving through the terminal, still organizing stragglers, still making sure that everyone made it out safely, still proving that real heroes don't always look the way we expect them to look, don't always come from the backgrounds we think they should come from, and don't always advertise their heroism in ways that make it easy for the rest of us to recognize and appreciate. Sometimes they look like ordinary old men in discount clothes, flying commercial through busy airports, carrying themselves with quiet dignity, while people like Marcus Chen make jokes about their appearance and question their authenticity. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in the most ordinary places, waiting for their moment to remind the rest of us what true service, courage, and sacrifice actually look like. Outside the terminal, the scale of the crisis became clear. What Marcus had experienced as isolated explosions and smoke were part of something much larger and more coordinated. Emergency vehicles filled the area around the airport. Fire trucks, ambulances, police cars, and federal response teams were arriving in waves. The air was thick with smoke and the sound of sirens, and airport personnel were struggling to coordinate the evacuation of one of the busiest airports in the country. Marcus's group had reached the designated emergency assembly area, a section of parking lot far enough from the terminal to be safe, but close enough for emergency responders to manage the thousands of displaced passengers. Around him, people were checking their phones, calling loved ones, trying to understand what had happened and when they might be able to continue their journeys. But Marcus found himself scanning the crowd for any sign of Colonel Rodriguez, the man who had organized their escape, who had turned panic into purpose and chaos into coordinated action, was nowhere to be seen among the evacuated passengers. "Has anyone seen the colonel?" Marcus asked the retired police officer who had led their group to safety. The older man who organized the evacuation from our gate. The officer, whose name Marcus had learned was Detective Warren, looked back toward the terminal with concern. He said he was going to do one final sweep to make sure no one was left behind. That was 20 minutes ago. 20 minutes. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air in Chicago. While everyone else had focused on getting themselves to safety, Rodriguez had gone back into a burning building to look for stragglers who might have been missed in the evacuation. At his age, with his obvious physical limitations, he had chosen to put himself in additional danger rather than accept the possibility that someone might need help. Marcus pulled out his phone and realized that among his scattered belongings, he had somehow held onto the device throughout the entire evacuation. His hands were shaking as he scrolled to his message history with Jake and read the texts he had sent earlier about the fake war hero wearing costume medals. The contrast between what he had written and what he had just witnessed was so stark that it felt like reading someone else's conversation. How had he been so wrong about something so important? How had his supposedly sophisticated understanding of human nature led him to such a completely incorrect assessment of a person's character and value? There he is, called out Detective Warren, pointing toward the terminal entrance. Through the smoke and chaos, Marcus could see Rodriguez emerging from the building. He was supporting a young woman who appeared to be injured, while simultaneously helping an elderly man who was moving slowly and breathing heavily. Behind them came two airport employees who had apparently been trapped somewhere in the terminal and were only now making their way to safety. Even at a distance, Marcus could see that the colonel was exhausted. His limp was more pronounced, his movements slower than they had been during the initial evacuation. But he was still focused on the people he was helping, still making sure they reached the medical personnel who were waiting in the emergency area. As Rodriguez and his group reached the triage station that had been set up near the ambulances, Marcus made a decision that surprised him. He walked over to where the colonel was finally, allowing a paramedic to examine him, apparently for the first time since the crisis had begun. "Colonel Rodriguez," Marcus said, his voice uncertain. Up close, he could see that the older man was more battered than he had appeared from a distance. His clothes were torn and singed, his hands were bleeding from cuts that must have come from broken glass or debris, and he was breathing heavily from exertion that had clearly pushed him well past his physical limits. Rodriguez looked up at him with eyes that were tired but still alert. "Are you injured?" was his first question, the response of someone whose primary concern was still the welfare of others despite his own obvious need for medical attention. "No, sir, I'm fine," Marcus replied. I wanted to thank you for what you did in there. You saved a lot of lives today." The colonel nodded politely, but without any sense of pride or self-congratulation. "Just did what needed to be done," he said simply. "Glad everyone made it out safely." Marcus stood there for a moment, struggling with how to express what he was feeling. How do you apologize to someone for assumptions you never shared with them directly? How do you admit that you had completely misjudged their character without sounding like you're making the conversation about your own guilt rather than their heroism? "Sir," Marcus finally said, "I need to ask you something. Your medals, your service record, it's all real, isn't it?" Rodriguez looked slightly puzzled by the question. "Of course it's real. Why would you ask that?" The honesty in his voice, the genuine confusion about why someone would question his service, hit Marcus harder than any accusation could have. This man had never pretended to be anything other than what he was. He hadn't been putting on a performance or seeking attention or trying to impress anyone. He had simply been a retired colonel doing what retired colonels do, traveling through airports, going about his business, carrying himself with the dignity that came from a lifetime of service. Marcus had been the one creating a false narrative, inventing motivations and character flaws that existed only in his own prejudices and assumptions. "I'm sorry," Marcus said. I made some assumptions earlier that I'm realizing were completely wrong." Before Rodriguez could respond, a young man in military uniform approached them. Marcus recognized him as the soldier who had been traveling with his family, the one Rodriguez had spoken with during the evacuation. "Colonel, sir," the young man said, coming to attention despite the informal circumstances. "I wanted to thank you for what you did today, and I wanted to ask, would you be willing to tell me about your service? I looked up your medals while we were waiting out here." Rodriguez looked uncomfortable with the attention, but he gestured for the soldier to sit down beside him. "What do you want to know, son?" "Well, sir, I was trying to figure out what unit you served with, and I found some information online that I wanted to verify. According to what I found, you served 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 tours in Iraq, and 1 tour in Afghanistan. Is that accurate?" Marcus felt his breath catch. 3 tours in Vietnam alone would have been extraordinary service. Adding Iraq and Afghanistan to that record meant Rodriguez had served in every major American conflict of the past 50 years. That's correct, Rodriguez confirmed quietly. And, sir, the young soldier continued, the records show you were awarded the Medal of Honor for actions in Vietnam, 2 Silver Stars, 3 Bronze Stars, and for Purple Hearts. Is that right? Marcus felt the world spin around him. The Medal of Honor. The highest decoration for valor in combat that the United States military could bestow. Only about 3,000 people in American history had ever received it, and Marcus had been making jokes about this man's fake medals just hours earlier. That's correct, Rodriguez said again, still uncomfortable with the attention. Sir, the young soldier said, his voice filled with awe, would you mind telling me about the Medal of Honor action? I've read the citation, but I'd like to hear it from you if you're willing to share. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could see him weighing whether to discuss something that was clearly painful to remember. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and distant, as if he was seeing events from decades in the past. My unit was caught in an ambush outside of Khe Sanh, he began. Heavy casualties, pinned down by enemy fire. We had wounded men who couldn't be evacuated, and our position was about to be overrun. He paused, looking down at his scarred hands. Marcus realized those weren't just any old scars. They were wounds from combat, from the kind of fighting that most Americans had only seen in movies. I managed to reach a position where I could suppress the enemy fire long enough for the wounded to be evacuated, Rodriguez continued. Took some shrapnel from a grenade, but everyone made it out alive. The young soldier was staring at him with obvious respect. Sir, according to the citation, you single-handedly held off an entire enemy company for 45 minutes while wounded, saving the lives of 18 men. Rodriguez shrugged slightly. Like I said, everyone made it out alive. That's what mattered. Marcus listened to this exchange with growing amazement and shame. This man wasn't just a veteran. He was one of the most decorated soldiers in American military history. And Marcus had dismissed him as a fraud because he didn't dress like a successful businessman, because he flew commercial instead of private, because he carried himself with humility rather than arrogance. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a news crew that had managed to get past the emergency perimeter. The reporter, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a microphone with a local news station logo, approached their group with obvious excitement. Excuse me, she said to Rodriguez. I'm Sarah Chun with Channel 7 News. We've been hearing reports about a veteran who helped organize the evacuation from Terminal B. Would you be willing to speak with us about what happened today? Marcus noted with irony that the reporter shared his last name, though no relation. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable with the attention, but nodded politely. I suppose so, he said. Can you tell our viewers what you saw and how you responded to the crisis? She asked, holding out her microphone. There were a lot of people who needed help, Rodriguez said simply. I've had some training in emergency situations, so I tried to organize things to make sure everyone got out safely. We understand you're a decorated veteran, the reporter continued. Can you tell us about your military background? I served for 35 years, Rodriguez replied. Multiple deployments. Just tried to do my job. The reporter was clearly hoping for something more dramatic, but Rodriguez's humble responses weren't giving her the kind of sound bites that would make for compelling television. Marcus could see her frustration as she tried to get the colonel to elaborate on his heroism, both in the airport and in his military service. Sir, she pressed, you have an extraordinary record of service, including the Medal of Honor. Don't you think the American people deserve to know about heroes like you? Rodriguez looked directly at her, and, for the first time, Marcus heard a slight edge in his voice. Young lady, he said, the real heroes didn't come home. I was just lucky enough to serve with some of the finest people this country has ever produced, and honored to wear the uniform they died wearing. The reporter looked taken aback by the response. She had been expecting a story about individual heroism, but Rodriguez was redirecting the conversation toward the people who hadn't survived to receive recognition for their service. But, surely, she continued, your actions today and throughout your career deserve recognition. Don't you think it's important for people to know about the sacrifices you've made for your country? Rodriguez stood up slowly, his conversation with the reporter clearly over. Ma'am, he said, the only thing that matters is that everyone made it home safely today. That's always been the only thing that matters. He walked away from the interview, leaving the reporter without the dramatic story she had been hoping to capture. But Marcus had heard everything he needed to hear. This was a man who had spent his entire adult life putting other people's welfare ahead of his own recognition, other people's safety ahead of his own comfort, other people's lives ahead of his own survival. And Marcus had looked at him and seen failure. Had seen someone who wasn't successful enough, wealthy enough, polished enough to deserve respect. Had seen the external trappings of a life lived in service to others and interpreted them as signs of personal inadequacy rather than evidence of character and sacrifice. As he watched Rodriguez walk back toward the medical station to check on the injured people he had helped evacuate, Marcus realized that everything he thought he knew about success, about heroism, about the measure of a man's worth, had been turned upside down in the span of a single afternoon. The most successful person he had ever met didn't look anything like what he had expected success to look like. The greatest hero he had ever encountered didn't advertise his heroism or demand recognition for his achievements. The most admirable man he had ever observed was someone he had initially dismissed as completely beneath his notice. Marcus pulled out his phone and looked at those text messages to Jake one more time. Then, he began typing a new message, trying to find words that could somehow capture what he had learned about assumptions, about prejudice, about the danger of judging others based on their appearance rather than their actions. But, as he tried to write, Marcus realized that no text message could convey the magnitude of what he had witnessed, or the depth of his own need to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the world and the people in it. 3 hours later, Marcus found himself sitting in the airport hotel lobby, his Colorado vacation officially canceled, his carefully planned schedule completely derailed. All flights had been suspended indefinitely, while federal investigators examined what had turned out to be a coordinated attack on multiple transportation hubs across the Midwest. The explosions at O'Hare were part of something much larger, though details were still emerging from official sources. But Marcus wasn't thinking about his vacation or his disrupted travel plans. He was thinking about a text message he had finally sent to Jake after an hour of trying to find the right words. Remember that fake veteran I was making fun of earlier? Turns out he's a Medal of Honor recipient who just saved hundreds of lives, including mine. I think I need to reconsider how I judge people. Jake's response had been immediate. Wait, what? Are you serious? Marcus had tried to explain what had happened, but the more he typed, the more inadequate his words seemed. How do you convey the complete collapse of your worldview in a series of text messages? How do you admit that your supposedly sophisticated understanding of human nature had been not just wrong, but dangerously, embarrassingly wrong? He was still struggling with these questions when he saw Colonel Rodriguez enter the hotel lobby. The older man had finally accepted medical attention and was now wearing a clean shirt provided by airport services, his cuts bandaged, his more serious injuries properly treated. But he still carried himself with that same quiet dignity that Marcus had initially misinterpreted as weakness. Marcus made a decision that he knew would be uncomfortable, but that felt necessary. He approached Rodriguez, who was sitting by himself near the hotel's restaurant, apparently waiting for transportation arrangements. Colonel, Marcus said, I wonder if I could speak with you for a few minutes. Rodriguez looked up and nodded toward an empty chair. Of course. What's on your mind? Marcus sat down, struggling with where to begin. Sir, I need to tell you something, and I need to apologize for something. Earlier today, before everything happened, I saw you in the security line, and I made some assumptions about you that were completely wrong. Rodriguez listened without expression as Marcus explained how he had judged the colonel based on his appearance, how he had assumed the medals were fake, how he had sent dismissive messages to his friend about stolen valor and attention-seeking behavior. I was completely wrong about everything, Marcus concluded. And I need you to know how sorry I am, not just for the assumptions I made, but for the fact that I was so quick to judge someone without knowing anything about them. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, considering what Marcus had said. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle rather than accusatory. Son, he said, why do you think you made those assumptions? The question caught Marcus off guard. He had expected anger, or a lecture about respect for veterans, or dismissal of his apology. He hadn't expected the colonel to approach this as a teaching moment. I guess, Marcus said slowly, I had certain ideas about what success looks like, what heroism looks like. I thought people who had really accomplished something would show it more obviously, would dress better, travel differently, carry themselves in a way that advertised their achievements. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. And where do you think those ideas came from? Marcus considered the question seriously. From my work, I think. I'm in marketing, and my job is about understanding what success looks like to consumers, what kinds of images and messages make people want to buy products or services. I've learned to judge people quickly based on external markers because that's what determines purchasing behavior. And that works in your business? Rodriguez asked. Usually, Marcus admitted. People generally do present themselves in ways that reflect their priorities and their resources. Successful people tend to dress expensively, drive nice cars, live in good neighborhoods. It's been a reliable way to understand my clients and their customers. Rodriguez was quiet again, and Marcus could see him thinking through what he had heard. Let me ask you something, the colonel said finally. What do you think my priorities are? Marcus thought about everything he had witnessed that day. Taking care of other people, he said without hesitation. Making sure everyone is safe. Serving others rather than yourself. And if those are my priorities, Rodriguez continued, what would you expect my external markers to look like? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. If Rodriguez's priority was serving others rather than accumulating personal wealth or status symbols, then, of course, he wouldn't look like a successful businessman. If he had spent his life focused on protecting people rather than building wealth, then, of course, he would fly commercial and wear modest clothes and live simply. Marcus had been looking for the wrong markers because he had been assuming the wrong priorities. He had judged Rodriguez by standards that were completely irrelevant to the values the colonel actually lived by. You don't measure success by what you accumulate, Marcus said, the realization dawning on him slowly. You measure it by what you give. Rodriguez smiled for the first time since Marcus had approached him. Now you're starting to understand. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment while Marcus absorbed the implications of what he was learning. Everything he thought he knew about achievement, about worth, about the proper way to evaluate another person's value, was being turned inside out. Can I ask you something else? Marcus said. Why didn't you correct me earlier? When I was making those assumptions about you, why didn't you set me straight? Rodriguez chuckled softly. Son, I've been dealing with people's assumptions about me for 73 years. Sometimes they assume I'm more than I am. Sometimes they assume I'm less. Most of the time, their assumptions tell me more about them than they tell them about me. But doesn't it bother you when people don't recognize your service or your achievements? The people whose recognition matters to me, Rodriguez said, know exactly what I've done and who I am. Everyone else's opinion is just noise. Marcus thought about this for a while. The people whose recognition matters to you. You mean other veterans? Your fellow soldiers? Partly, Rodriguez agreed. But also people like that young father with his family today. People like the elderly passengers who needed help during the evacuation. People who were scared and needed someone to take charge and get them to safety. Marcus began to understand. Rodriguez didn't need recognition from strangers or approval from society at large because he found his validation in the act of service itself, in the knowledge that he had used his skills and experience to protect people who needed protection. I've spent my whole career trying to impress people, Marcus said, trying to prove my worth through external achievements, expensive things, visible success. But you've spent your career actually being valuable to people, actually making a difference in their lives. Different people are called to different kinds of service, Rodriguez replied diplomatically. Your work probably helps people in ways you don't even realize. But Marcus wasn't ready to let himself off the hook that easily. My work is about convincing people to buy things they might not need from companies that might not deserve their business. Your work has been about saving people's lives, protecting their freedom, putting yourself in danger so they could be safe. Rodriguez studied Marcus carefully. Is that really all your work is about? Marcus considered the question. Well, no. Sometimes I help companies communicate genuinely valuable services to people who really need them. Sometimes I help good organizations reach people who would benefit from what they offer. And when you do that kind of work, Rodriguez asked, how does it feel different from the other kind? The question stopped Marcus cold. He knew exactly what Rodriguez was talking about. The campaigns he was proudest of were the ones where he felt like he was helping connect people with something that would genuinely improve their lives. The projects that felt meaningful were the ones where his skills were being used to serve something larger than his own success. It feels like the work matters, Marcus said quietly. Like I'm using my abilities for something worthwhile instead of just for personal advancement. Rodriguez nodded. Then, you understand the difference between working for recognition and working for purpose. They were interrupted by the arrival of a transportation service that Rodriguez had apparently arranged. As the colonel gathered his few belongings, Marcus felt a sudden urgency to ask one more question. Sir, what would you tell someone who wanted to change the way they approach their life and their work? someone who realized they had been measuring success by the wrong standards. Rodriguez paused in his preparations to leave. I'd tell them that it's never too late to start living by your values instead of other people's expectations. I'd tell them that the most important question isn't what will people think of me, but what kind of person do I want to be? As Rodriguez prepared to leave, Marcus stood up and extended his hand. Colonel, thank you for what you did today and for what you've taught me. Rodriguez shook his hand firmly. Son, you don't need to thank me. Just remember what you learned today and pass it on when you get the chance. As Marcus watched the colonel leave the hotel lobby, he realized that his vacation in Colorado had been replaced by something much more valuable. He had learned something about himself, about his assumptions, about the difference between image and substance that would change how he approached every relationship and every decision for the rest of his life. He pulled out his phone and opened a new message to his assistant. Cancel all my meetings for the rest of the week, he typed. I need some time to think about what kind of work I want to do and what kind of person I want to be. Then, he opened another message, this one to Jake. I need to tell you the whole story about what happened today. But the short version is that I learned something about heroes that I think everyone needs to understand. He paused for a moment, thinking about how to capture the magnitude of what he had experienced. Real heroes don't always look like what we expect them to look like. Sometimes they look like ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And sometimes the most successful people are the ones who have given up everything that looks like success in order to serve something more important than themselves. As Marcus sent the message and leaned back in his hotel chair, he realized that his encounter with Colonel James Rodriguez had done more than save his life. It had given him a completely new understanding of what life was for, what success really meant, and what kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. The man he had mocked as a fraud had turned out to be one of the most authentic people he had ever met. The person he had dismissed as a failure had turned out to be more successful than Marcus had ever dreamed of being. The stranger he had judged and found wanting had turned out to be exactly the kind of person Marcus hoped he could somehow learn to become. 9 minutes of chaos had changed everything Marcus thought he knew about heroism, about service, about the true measure of a man's worth. And, as he sat in that airport hotel lobby, canceled vacation plans forgotten, Marcus Chin began to think seriously about what it would mean to start measuring his own life by the standards he had learned from Colonel James Rodriguez rather than the standards he had inherited from a world that confused price with value, appearance with substance, and recognition with respect. The old man with the medals had laughed at no one, but he had taught everyone around him something about what it really means to be a hero. And Marcus knew he would spend the rest of his life trying to live up to that example.